Great. Well, thank you all for joining. For those that I haven't met before, hello, my name is Jessica Davison. I'm with United Way of Greater Houston. We are so glad that you could join us today for our Data in Dish featuring the inequities of Houston. And again, we're just really thankful that you're joining us for today on the heels of Tropical Storm Hurricane Nicholas. We know that this week has been part of an ongoing compounding challenge with natural disasters that are impacting our region, communities, and our well-being. So we're just really glad that you're here with us today. So if this is your first time attending a Data in Dish, again, double welcome. We often use the Data in Dish platform to bring awareness to the ALICE data. And for those who don't know ALICE is an acronym that stands for Asset Limited, Income Constrained, Employed. The ALICE data is a quantitative data analysis of what it takes to make ends meet, and it's specific to the county, state, community. And while ALICE is data, it's also people. It's people just like you and me who live, work, and breathe in our community. And so with that brought about this opportunity to reach out to One Breath Partnership, who is joining us here today. And so One Breath Partnership was formed about 5 years ago to change narratives, a media collaboration among Air Alliance Houston, Environmental Defense Fund, Environmental Integrity Project, Environmental Texas, Public Citizen, and Rice University. They work upward from the expertise of community organizers, scientists, physicians, lawyers, journalists, and researchers to tell stories about real people's lives at the intersection of climate, health, policy, and environmental justice. And they are behind an incredible 4-part series on the shape of Houston inequities. And I'll share that link in the chat if you haven't checked it out yet. This is often referred to as the Houston Arrow. So today, the author, Leah Binkovitz, the data visualization designer, Evan O'Neill, will share more about their articles and the maps. And then we'll have a conversation with Keith Downey, a community leader and super neighborhood president in historical Black Kashmir Gardens. So please give me a warm Data in Dish welcome to the group. And I will hand it off to Leah. Please feel free to mute while they're presenting and drop any questions in the chat that you have. We're so glad you're here.
Thank you so much, Jessica. And yeah, definitely feel free to use the chat because I will check it after the presentation and see if there's anything that we can follow up on, anything like that. I see more people are joining, which is great, but I'll go ahead and get started. I'll introduce myself. My name is Leah Binkovitz. I'm a journalist. I'm also a PhD student over at Rice, studying sociology. And so this series came about thanks to Alan West with One Breath. And I want to preface it by saying that the arrow is not something that we created. It's probably a term that many of you have already used. It's an idea that's been around for quite a bit. Organizers, reporters, researchers, data folks in general have all used it to talk about patterns of inequality broadly in Houston. And Houston is, of course, not unique in having a shape like this. In Houston, it takes this particular form, but we see this kind of patterning on many major US cities. And minor US cities. So I wanted to start with an example here from Twitter. A lot of you probably know Zoe Middleton. She was with Texas Housers and is just an all-around amazing housing advocate in Houston. And this was a thread that she started on Twitter about the Houston Arrow. She kind of describes it's visible on almost any map of Houston with social data, a fancy way of saying measurable information about our lives layered on top of it. So some of the examples I'm sorry, I'm not in play. That would be helpful, wouldn't it? She mentions, for example, John Harden, when he used to be with the Chronicle, kind of describing the geography a little bit. He did a series of maps, but it's that western half, he said, that pushes through Memorial and points through to downtown. Here's another example, this one really relevant given recent events. This is funding need by watershed. We're not used to, I think, seeing Harris County divided up this way, but these are kind of the major water systems and the needs in terms of funding to really to take care and respond to flooding issues. So you can see that there's kind of this divide emerging east-west, and you can also see that nice green kind of running through the western side there, and that touches a large portion of the arrow. Here's a map from Jeff at January Advisors, another great data guy around Houston. And this is a map of people who were arrested for marijuana. So you can see how criminalization in the arrow can be presented together. Another map here, Harris County COVID-19 Relief Fund. This, you can really start to see some of those lines emerging clearly. So just a few examples there, but I want to say that even for folks who aren't working with data and maps, the arrow is kind of intuitive. You mentioned River Oaks or Memorial, and people know what side of town that is. And our series on the arrow tries to start there with the arrow as something that you can experience for yourself as you move through the city. So it shows up in differing land uses, architectures, amenities, especially. Zoe told me about her old commute along Richmond Avenue. So that's kind of where we started it, as one of the ways that she saw this. And Richmond Avenue sits near the southern edge of the arrow. So it's a bit of a transitional space where you can kind of take it all in as you travel toward downtown. So she said, you see the whole state of buildings where people live, these weird glass high rises to single family homes to multifamily that's in need of a lot of attention and repair. And you see the difference in amenities. This video, my husband made it. We're gonna speed down Richmond Avenue. For those of you who haven't done it, don't drive this fast, but you can kind of start to see some of these differences that we're talking about. Like you'll see when we get to Galleria area, some of the high rises emerging. You can see some of the different infrastructures, and we'll end up at Montrose. So there we are, Montrose, the intersection that I hate. So there's this view of the arrow from the ground, from the experience, and then there's this view that we get from all these maps. From that perspective, the arrow is this useful bit of shorthand for data folks, advocates, community organizers, because it's so consistent and it holds across so many different things. In our story, we reference the landscapes of hazardous waste facilities, people with college degrees or higher, childhood asthma rates, and more. So kind of no matter your interest in Houston, your work probably has some relationship to the arrow. But as we all know, maps can only tell so much of the story. What might appear like this kind of disconnected series of metrics that happen to show up in the same pattern over and over, so like what does asthma have to do with college degrees, for example, is evidence of something deeply connected and intertwined. And that's what we tried to speak to in this series, starting from this very identifiable geography and the very useful tool of mapping, and trying to bring to the surface the history and the structures of power that created and reproduce it. So in sociology, which is what I'm studying now, but in public policy as well, you'll often hear formulations that essentially say, well, poverty causes X condition, or segregation leads to Y outcome. But there are structures even behind those that organize the logic of all of this. So some people use frameworks like racial capitalism, for example, you may have heard that term, to make sense of the coordinated yet flexible forms of racist exploitation and oppression. And just to draw this out a little, so I was just in a meeting where colleagues were discussing the various segregation indices out there. So how best to measure the degree of segregation within a space. But the reason why segregation matters isn't because segregation necessarily does anything on its own. Space does not act on its own. Instead, it requires racism, it requires capitalism, it requires these broader systems to make segregation meaningful in the way it is today. And that's sort of the move in terms of stepping back from the arrow. So starting with the arrow, but stepping back a bit that we were hoping to make here. And it's a useful mindset to have, I think, when so many of the things that we can measure and map might not directly speak to that or directly tell that story. So I think we have to do that work. In the second part of the series, I try to do some of that by looking at the development of River Oaks, as well as Memorial and key sites like Buffalo Bayou Park. So the public library archives are amazing. Even if you can't go there in person right now, the digitized stuff is great. They have great materials on River Oaks, including letters from early investors and newspaper articles and advertisements that show how the 1920s development was being positioned and marketed in this very deliberate way. So through these sources, you can see how this wealthy enclave relied on exclusion from the city masses on the one hand, but support from the city powers on the other. So the development was touted in one advertisement as both highly restricted and in the very heart of the most rapid and extensive improvements imaginable. So there were deed restrictions and gentlemen's agreements and promises of infrastructural improvements from the city, all happening in coordination to produce this enclave. Importantly, though, this was never intended to just be a retreat. The advertisements also promised that buying into River Oaks will serve as an investment. The ads promised would double within a year. So how are they able to promise all of these things? Connections and money. The Hogg siblings, for example, who were involved, were the grandchildren of enslaver and Confederate General Joseph Lewis Hogg and the children of Texas Governor James Stephen Hogg. The family's Brazos County plantation would eventually yield oil and a lot of their wealth. They served in city government and they were able to work these connections for their own ends. That's just one example. There are more in the article, including how Camp Logan became Memorial Park, and more not in the article as well. It's just didn't have space for all of it, but the relationship that wealthy white developer elite had to city government, and often they were one and the same, has been characterized by multiple scholars. So Kyle Shelton described it in his book Power Moves. He says, a ruling class of white male bankers, real estate, whoops, your heads are blocking it, but developers, lumber and cotton magnates and oil men. That kind of became the elite within Houston. George Lipschitz has also used the phrase white racial cartel when talking about Houston history. That's pretty efficient, effective phrase there. And the effect of all this is that white elites were able to build spaces within Houston that would not only benefit from the labor of the rest of the city, but would produce new wealth for those already wealthy residents. This isn't just a legacy effect, though. Seemingly neutral things today, like the city's tax increment reinvestment zones, show how wealthy areas can continue to reproduce this process. So now we've got some of the pieces of the arrow falling into place to explain what is there today. But I think it's important to remember that not only was it not always this way, but that it was not inevitable that it would be this way. The story of Freedmen's Town is, I think, fairly well known in the city. This is the mother ward of Black Houston, where Jack Yates first settles and where so many others gathered. And the popular story goes, it eventually gets eaten up by market-driven gentrification. But as scholars of gentrification will tell you, the conditions that make gentrification possible are policy decisions. So in this section, we used oral histories from the Gregory School to offer a picture of community life in the early and mid-1900s in Freedmen's Town. So how does a Black community go from vibrant and close-knit to hanging on? Scholars like Robert Bullard and Fred McGee look at how government decisions work to displace, destroy, and denigrate the space, a task that local media often supported by repeatedly casting Freedmen's Town as derelict and dysfunctional. And you can really see that in coverage of Allen Parkway Village in particular. And again, this is a narrative we see supported in sociological research as well. Often economic shifts in labor and employment are used to explain increasing concentrations of poverty, which is a pattern that we have here in Houston as well. And the resulting so-called culture of poverty or culture of segregation, depending on which brand of kind of questionable framing you want. But we can see in Freedmen's Town that there were very deliberate steps taken, like the initial development of Allen Parkway Village as an all-white housing project. And they built that over what was sort of the core of Freedmen's Town. So they demolished housing, put in an all-white housing project. And then as kind of the demographics shifted, there's this subsequent neglect. Hope 6 comes in and takes out a lot of the units, downsizing it, and just sort of, again, displacing more residents. Or there's the highway construction, the condemning of institutions like the colored Carnegie Library, and on and on. Evan created some really amazing maps for this section that you should definitely look at if you haven't, and he's recreating some of these historic sites. Altogether, as McGee argues, if we understand these as coordinated and intentional actions, we begin to see how city powers work to empty out spaces of Black people in order to refashion them for development, redevelopment, wealth. The story also tries to wrestle with the fight to preserve Freedmen's Town and just how uneven that fight is thanks to these forces that continue to work to displace the community that made Freedmen's Town. In the final installment, Moving Beyond Maps, I attempt to start to think through where we go from here. So we know about the arrow, we know how persistent it is, what now? Well, first and foremost, I think reparations of some form have to be on the table. It's not enough to declare Freedmen's Town, for example, a cultural district now, right, and invest dollars now, because who's going to benefit from that? The city gets to tout its diverse history and make tourism out of Black resilience stories, but what about the Black people who are long gone or struggling to stay? As Purvis Hall notes in the piece, so much has been stolen and there have been promises made. And these aren't new demands. I think that's important to keep in mind too. Looking back at old issues of the Houston Informer, for example, you can see the platform that the publisher, Clifton F. Richardson Sr., he would print in every issue. And some of the platform goals were large, like racial cooperation, teamwork, advancement, betterment, and solidarity. But many were really specific. He wanted playgrounds for Black children, upgraded school facilities, legislation to end lynching, good streets, better drainage, and sanitary toilets, and more. So we've known what to do for a long time, as appealing as more task forces might be. For this particular data-minded crowd, I think the dynamics of the arrow also ask us to go a little further in our own work. I want to end on a quote from one of my favorite scholars and thinkers, Catherine McKittrick. So she says, I'm going to have to move your heads, aren't I? But you can see it on the screen. Geography is not secure and unwavering. We produce space. We produce its meanings, and we work very hard to make geography what it is. To me, this means as someone who is writing about space or mapping space, I have a responsibility to make plain the assumptions of knowledge behind these processes. What is rendered geographically meaningful and what is not? What shows up and what doesn't? What do our maps serve to naturalize or normalize? And how can we do our work while unsettling the ways maps are presumed to work? These are ongoing questions I ask myself. And to me, it's also connected to the kinds of material solutions that we are able to imagine. In both cases, though, I'm going to pass it on here. I think the other speakers can better address some of these questions. So I'm going to hand it off to Evan, but I'm so glad that we're able to hear from both Evan and Keith. I think their perspectives are super important here. So I'll hand it off.
Cool, thanks so much, Leah. I'm going to work on sharing my screen. I always stumble on this part. Okay. Cool, got it. Yeah, thank you so much, Leah, and thanks overall for being the guide of such a powerful, important piece of work too. Yeah, there's been so many just really important findings and excellent articulation of this. So thank you. And thanks to you all for having me here. So this is gonna go behind and beyond the arrow. Short introduction, my name's Evan O'Neill. I'm a designer and developer. I work with One Breath Partnership and a few other advocacy organizations out there. And I see some of you all in the participant section. So thanks for joining. So mapping is a big part of what I do, which means I make the same map over and over and over again, and I just put new titles on it. And I think anyone who's made maps has had the same just sense of despair about it, that we just make more maps and they show the same thing, and we know exactly what's happening, and it just gets more and more defined. So sorry for the downer of an intro. It's going to get better from here. So what we're going to talk about is, first, I'm going to just talk about the tools used in the creation of the site, then talk a little bit about how we connect information, updates for the census and what's happened over the summer, and then questions what the arrow will leave behind and what happens next. So I know we don't have the time for like a code share, and I'm not totally sure if there's even interest in that, but if anybody is interested, please just get in touch with me. I always be more than happy to talk through all this. So at top level, look at the skills or tools that went into this. Mapbox Studio is how I made the maps, and used a lot of data from Corey Williams at Air Alliance Houston was a huge help in providing a lot of these data sets. So thank you to Corey and Air Alliance Houston. The 2010 census data was kind of the backbone of a lot of this too. I don't feel the need to say thanks to the census. And then the Department of Health Services, I forget exactly what it is. It's the Texas one. I usually just call it DISHES. And so I'm blanking on the full acronym there, but thanks to DISHES. So the main Yeah, the main library that I used for the scroll animations and for the story map is called Scrollama. Here's a link to something that explains it a lot better than me, but it's a really cool library and helps a lot with the data visualization work and story maps that we used in part 3. And then the locations from that story map were put together in large part by audio recordings that Leah found from the Gregory School and just some other miscellaneous research, which was kind of hard to track down the full history of Freedmen's Town. And it would also throw out that that would be a really useful project for someone to take on. So here's this overall GIF, just in case anyone needs be caught up on this, kind of how the arrow comes together, all the different things that it's visible in, well, not all, but a very short sampling, and kind of the thought process behind like how we structured this. And it ends on the white population because what I think Leah's reporting creates a very clear picture about is that it's always been about race. Like, you know, the arrow didn't magically appear. It wasn't even created as something like, let's say, to have a place where there's no childhood asthma. Like, it was just like these dudes wanted a white place. And they were very successful in creating that, and it still persists. And the white population part of the map, I think, is very useful to use as a shorthand because class and race and health outcomes and everything else is so intricately tied, and it's all tied back to race. And one of the things where we really see this is this map of COVID vulnerability with ozone pollution on top. And in, you know, all the maps you see, not only do they correlate nearly entirely, but that arrow in the middle here is visible in both. So part of what the arrow has left is environmental risk, and yeah, and we're seeing that right now with the worst COVID outcomes too. So it's a powerful, terrible shape, and it's shaping the lives of people inside and outside, you know, respectively, for better and worse. So one question is, did anything change from when we did it? Even though we put this together early part of the summer, late part of the spring, which now feels like 20 years ago. So has anything changed since then? The first part is rates of COVID vaccinations. So on the left, this data was from June 7th. On the right, this data is from September 13th. So even after the cash incentives that the county and the city have been doing kicked in. And overall vaccination rates are going up a little bit, but it's the same map. Yeah, which, you know, you see the exact same shape, the exact same inequities. And so the efforts that are being made are, you know, are not being equitable. So I think as a small part, even when you look at the cash incentives, where is it really working? You know, I don't know. That's another subject, but not too great. And then the other part that, you know, I kind of thought we were using 2010 census data, and everything in Houston branding is Houston so diverse, diversity. And so, you know, this is the page from the Greater Houston Partnership, who of course is always above board, and really, you know, never disingenuous about anything of why you should put your business in Houston. And so if we're touting this diversity all the time, you know, maybe there's the hope that we could start to see the arrow dissipating a little bit. And that, you know, we are truly becoming more diverse and not just, you know, segregated into little pocket city. So wanted to look at this, and this 2020 the initial 2020 census data recently came out. So we could kind of check this, you know, is this getting better? Is the Greater Houston Partnership's branding for the city really, you know, fair and accurate? Nope. Just another disingenuous statement from the Greater Houston Partnership. So in fact, here's a GIF of the 2010 BIPOC population versus the 2020. And unfortunately, we see that, you know, not only does the arrow persist, but it's getting more and more defined too. These boundaries are getting filled in, and the divides are getting harsher, which Yeah, I mean, I think it's important because Houston policy often operates on kind of magic and faith. And when there's trends, those trends are going to continue, and unless there's real policy that steps in to stop it. And so we see where it's going, and we have a good idea of where it's going to go in 2030 too. And it's going to need some real hard policy to get in the way of that and start reversing this. And it's also significant that it's getting more and more defined because it goes against the overall demographic trends. And this also is from the initial census returns. And I'll say the full census data is going to be released tomorrow. So that's exciting if you were into census information. Unfortunately, it's a day after this. So there'll still be some more to look into, but for the redistricting releases, we do have a pretty clear picture of what's happening, certainly racially. And that's that the white population in Houston has decreased by about 30% over the last decade, even though the overall population has rose by 10%, which makes it pretty staggering that that arrow is getting more and more defined. And I mean, that speaks to how intentional it is and kind of the center of gravity that was created a century ago. And so one question that I think is worth asking is the arrow expanding, or is it just kind of staying here? And it's a complicated question, because I think what we really want is more for conditions to rise outside of the arrow, but and that it's not necessarily a bad thing if the city gets more diverse and less homogenous and segregated, but it has to be done in the right way. And so this map was done by the Houston Chronicle, and it shows the population changes at a census tract level. And so what we're seeing is, north side, parts of the Fifth Ward, East End, are seeing population decreases. And it's kind of showing up a lot in people who are being removed and leaving these historic neighborhoods. So Black and Hispanic neighborhoods that have had people there for a long time are, seeing changes and seeing people moving out and being displaced. I'd say the 45 expansion certainly threatens to exacerbate that even more. One specific data point too is the Third Ward saw its Black population drop by about 15%, even though the neighborhood's overall population grew by about 30%. Which shows a pretty troubling displacement that's happening, and that's right at the edge of the arrow. This map, also from the early 2020 returns, shows unoccupied housing, which I think raises a question more than anything. But what's happening there? Is this people being displaced? Is this new housing being created that there's not the market for? Anecdotally, it certainly seems like on the East End, maybe this is more people flipping houses and gentrification showing up. But that's something that I would, leave the full answers to. And I mean, anecdotes are powerful, but only go so far. But I think that's something to really be looking at. And then what are the secondary and following effects of that? So a while ago, I digitized the redlining maps that Susan Rogers wrote a great piece for a site and was in the Chronicle too about these. I suspect a lot of people are familiar with these, but this was basically a guide to where investment, should and shouldn't happen. And so the red areas were what were redlined to be hazardous communities. We know that's completely a function of racism, and there's a real legacy of racism that persists from these redlining maps. These were done across every major city in the country too. And the effects are pretty long-standing. So sorry for the goofy angle on this, but this is a map of the redlining maps with the schools from HISD that were under improvement required, which put the district at risk for takeover by the state. A lot of these were outside of the loop, but the ones that were inside the loop when the redlining map was created, really no surprise that 3 of them are right in a neighborhood that was redlined. This is one of the kind of longer term effects of this map, even though it's officially no longer in practice. And then through one breath, me and Alan and Corey at Air Alliance put together this map, overlaying the redlining map with the toxic release inventory. So the black dots or black squares are all places that release toxic emissions. And this overall picture kind of came together that the toxic facilities are a legacy of the redlining maps. So it overall becomes very clear that a legacy of redlining is toxic facilities that are left because it's cheaper and easier to build there. Even though a lot of these facilities were built after redlining was officially no longer in use. They show up now in terms of childhood asthma rates, cancer rates, cardiovascular issues, not to mention the social effects that follow chronic disease and early death. So we know these intentionally planned maps of disparity can leave effects long after the shapes disappear or morph into something new. Within the arrow, it's a shorthand for where wealth is and where resources, where access, everything that's kind of desirable in quality of life is located. And then outside of the arrow is really shorthand for places that are being underserved and lack basic services and resources. This is a map of HEB locations, and there's more grocery stores. I don't have the full data set. There are more grocery stores outside of the arrow, but you do see this huge disparity there. And outside of the arrow is really a shorthand also for places where extractive development can take place. And when it's done, it shows up as gentrification. I'll start closing up here, but one kind of cheesy anecdote, but I think that there's it's somewhat relevant, is so Sam Houston was in Alabama committing genocide against Native Americans, and he got shot with an arrow in the butt. And don't feel bad for him because he was on the wrong side there. But one of the quotes from the historical marker is, "The ugly wound never completely healed, troubling Houston for the rest of his life." And I think that's powerful because what we have in this arrow shape is an open wound. And if we don't do something to fix it, it's going to trouble the city, for the rest of our lives, or the rest of the city's life. Thinking 100 years out, the same way that we are from the redlining maps, we don't do something about this wound, it's just going to fester. And so, the data sets we've worked with, combined with other data sets like the Transportation Equity Demand Index that Link has put together, and the ALICE data that United Way has put together, really gives a clear picture of where we need to be doing work and what we need to do. Again, like people in the comments section, at least, nobody said this to me, but in the almighty comment section, people express a lot of guilt and say like, oh, should I just move outside the arrow? No, like the goal is to, erase the arrow by improving conditions. And so if we were able to make the good conditions inside the arrow happen, then surely with all the tools we have now, we can make it happen outside of the arrow too. We need, good policy and good advocates to make that happen. And the stakes are, literally life and death. So I'm gonna, now that we are starting to talk about the solutions and everything going forward, I'm gonna turn it over to Keith. If I can figure out how to stop sharing. All right, I think I got it done.
Thank you, Evan. I appreciate that. Thank you so much. I want to welcome everyone here today. I want to thank United Way for having me. And I want to start off by saying the laborer doesn't live in a mansion. The laborers who help build this city do not live in a mansion. On a daily basis, many community advocates in minority communities are actually equity advocates. And so we're dealing with, when we're dealing with poor education, we're dealing with a lack of food, we're dealing with food insecurity, we're dealing with a lack of clean air, clean water in our minority communities, flood mitigation. We must ensure that everyone has a good quality of life. We must understand that everyone doesn't have what we have. The average resident in our community has to travel 8 miles north, 6 miles west for quality food and retail. What about those who don't have transportation, quality transportation? They have to depend on the buses. They have to depend on metro lift or what have you. We must understand everyone doesn't have the blessings that we have. And how did we get here? We got here through decades of policy. Decades of policy that made it the have versus the have-nots. We must understand that everyone must come along and have not only equality, but minority communities must have equity. And what is equity? Equity is that I might need an extra leg up to help me, to help my family, to help my community. It doesn't mean taking away from the affluent so they will not have. It means that I want to have a quality of life and I want to have a healthy community just like anyone else. I deserve that. I'm a taxpayer. I deserve to live like everyone else lives. And it doesn't mean taking away from, it means adding to. And we must understand that. We shouldn't have to go into a grocery store last year or several grocery stores in minority communities to find out food is on the shelf that has a sell-by date of 2019 or 2017. But that is going on. That's the reality. We must face the reality that everyone is not being brought along equally. We must understand that many in our community are dealing with survival. We are all in survival mode at different levels. Some have more in the bank than others. Some don't even have a bank. We tell, seniors tell us back in the day, you would hear the term, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. But what if you have no boots? We must understand that a lot of this policy from decades past have led us to where we are today. We must help everyone come along. And we must all speak about equity and inclusion for all in Houston. Let's take, for example, the average age in the United States is 78.9 years old. The average age in the 77005 zip code, which is West University Place, is 84 years old. The average age for a resident in Cashmere Garden is 69.8 years old. Something is wrong. Something is wrong in Houston, in the Houston area, and we must correct it. We must take the time to help everyone. While poverty, lack of access, living in heavy industrial neighborhoods play key roles, we must understand that we must help those who have no voice. Many residents feel, well, it's going to be the way it is. But that's why community leaders fight for equity. Because we understand it doesn't have to be this way. Many have to understand that we can do this working together. And again, I say it's not about taking away from someone. It's about helping you to help me. It's about helping me to have quality produce on the tables of our families and our communities as well, Black and brown communities. We have a farmer's market that we started with Urban Harvest in Cashmere Garden. Why did we have to do that as community advocates? Because we don't have quality produce. We don't have access to healthy foods to put on our tables of our families. And it's been going on for over 2 years, and we pray that it continues because we need that in our communities. We need people to understand that we need quality, not just quantity, because it's not about quantity. We have to have a quality education in our communities. Some of our students are the most aspiring students. They want to be doctors. They want to be lawyers. They want to be able to go to college or to the military. But there are barriers that have been put in place that prohibit them from doing so. One of the purposes for wraparound services was to address socioeconomic issues in minority communities, so that students will have an extra, have that extra piece that they need, because they're fighting so many other things in their community to try to get a quality education. We must understand that everyone needs equity. Everyone needs equality, not just for some, but for everybody. When we talk about flood mitigation, I have a dear, sweet senior in the community. She says, Mr. Downey, whenever heavy rain is imminent, and she say, you can quote me, I get the hell out of Dodge. I call my daughter in Sugar Land because I want to get to higher ground, because I'm right there on the bayou. I don't want to be flooded out anymore. One thing we must understand, the poor do not ask to be poor. They would like to have services. They would like to have education, quality education, and they would also like to be able to own homes and not rent. We must put people on a road to home ownership in minority communities. They don't want to wait for gentrification to come in and be outpriced and have to move. Where can they move for pennies on the dollar? Where can they live? But these are the people that help build those communities. These are the people that help build Houston. These are the people that help work on Clinton Drive in the industrial area of the Port of Houston, or out in Deer Park, or what have you. And they do so to this day. We must understand that we have to help everyone. We as community leaders continue to receive phone calls from residents that are still dealing with Hurricane Harvey. So I beg the question, is everyone in Houston in the 21st century? Many of our communities, minority communities, don't have Wi-Fi connectivity. So when they hear about a Zoom call or they hear about Google Meets, there should be a phone number attached to that, because they will have to use the phone. They have no other option. We must also understand that everyone must come along on this recovery. I remember as a disaster case manager, I worked years of doing that after Hurricane Harvey. We went into homes that needed to be muck and gutted, as many did. One of the homes in Northeast Houston had black walls along the base and black floor, and I thought it was Hurricane Harvey, so I asked the homeowner, Hurricane Harvey? She said, no, Hurricane Allison. We must give people access to resources in our communities. Many decades of policy has led us to where we are. We must have equitable funding The people of Northeast Houston and Third Ward and Friendswood and other areas should not be turned down by FEMA when a storm comes. We must change policy at the federal level on down. We must change the way we do business to help residents. You know, it's very expensive to be poor. It's very expensive to be poor when you're going to a store that's in your neighborhood and you're paying higher prices for less quality. We must understand everyone doesn't have the blessings or live like we do, but they would love to, and they are owed that. I had the pleasure of taking a drive with Henk Ovink, who is a Dutch special envoy to the UN now. He was the ambassador for waterway in the Netherlands. And he spoke at Rice University. But before he did that, hours before, he asked Mr. Downer, can you give me a drive through minority communities in Houston? He looked, he said, wow, open drainage ditches. We don't have that in the Netherlands. He said, he talked to residents. He said, you know, how are you coming along? How will you be coming along on recovery? And they said, well, we don't have flood insurance. We're depending on FEMA, but we were denied. He said, no, this is not the way. So he went to Rice University that night and he spoke. And he said to the people at Rice University in the auditorium, and he said, I'm speaking to Houston. Unless you bring everyone along on recovery from these storms, you're bringing no one along on recovery, because every storm that comes here after will put the minority community that much more behind. So we have to understand, we must include everyone when we talk about funding. We must include minority communities because they have helped us to be where we are in the other side of the arrow, the back side of the arrow. And in conclusion, I want to say this. While the issues of racial inequality and systematic racism are not unique to the city of Houston, we have an opportunity as Houstonians to lead the way in transforming broken systems, because it's broken. We must fix our systems and change our way of thinking. There's another way to do business. Partnering with communities, offering support, and removing barriers. We often speak with pride of Houston being America's most diverse city, as was pointed out, and we've heard this over and over and over again. Now we must work to make Houston America's most inclusive city, one that does truly offer opportunity for all. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Keith, Evan, Leah. Before we get into Q&A, I know there's been some questions posed in the chat. I'd love to just give a virtual round of applause. Feel free to unmute and give applause as well. Just thank you all so much for sharing, for bringing to light your 4-part series. We're just so thankful. And so I do know there was a question. I caught one question in the chat that I'm trying to circle back to. It was the chat's a busy place. But one question is coming from Mary Noel. And so I wanted to start with that one. Are you planning, and this could go to either three, but are you planning to include the intellectual and physical disabled in your focus of population diversity? That's the question. And then where are these individuals located and or serviced?
Yeah, I could speak to that a little bit. I know it would be absolutely very important, and yeah, like is the wrong word, but I would really like to be able to have access to data sets that show the locations, needs, kind of everything about people with all sorts of accessibility needs. Yeah, so I think the data sets that I've had access to are more the chronic health condition side of this, but yeah, I'm certainly on the look for that. And if you have any leads or any ideas where I could get those data sets, then I think we could really use that across a lot of different types of work too. So yeah, I mean, the short answer is yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to find good data sets, especially in Houston, where we don't really have much of an open data policy. And a lot of the data sets are siloed. But yeah, if you have any leads, please let me know. Sorry, my short answer was longer than my long answer.
Thank you. Appreciating the short and long answer. That's always good. Leah or Keith, anything to add on that? If you saw anything kind of being lifted up for individuals with disabilities or intellectual differences?
I think we must include everyone. Those with disabilities, those able-bodied, we must understand that, like I said, everyone doesn't look like us. Everyone doesn't have the ability that we have. And yes, we must address those with disabilities because they need help as well. So we must bring equity to them also. And community leaders know their communities. Community residents know their communities. One size does not fit all, but we must understand that we have to help those who need help and cannot help themselves.
And I'll add just briefly, I shared a link, I'll share it again since the chat is moving fast, but it's something that I am not an expert in, but the organization that I have looked to when I want to know more about this, because the data is kind of lacking, even the state and kind of their efforts to organize, especially around like disaster recovery response. There's supposed to be a registry, but it never quite works out the way that they say it will. But Living Hope Wheelchair Association is a great organization here in Houston that does specifically advocate not only for disabled folks, but specifically undocumented. So they kind of work at that intersection of folks who are most likely to kind of be left out. And that particular piece was a report that came after Harvey. But if you're looking for more ways to plug in, I think that would be a great place to start.
Great, thank you. And there's some more comments in the chat, a lot of uplifting of different accesses to different resources and really highlighting that point on equity for all, regardless of their ability. So thank you. And then there's another question here, Leah, and it's actually for you because of your comment about that intersection at Montrose. So I think they're curious, some comments, kind of carry weight with other folks. And so what was the intersection on Montrose you were not a fan of and why? So
all right, that was a throwaway comment, just an intersection where I see a lot of people having trouble with those left turns and just a lot of struggles right there. But like so many intersections in Houston, just I guess that does highlight the problems that we have with pedestrian safety and all of that across Houston.
Great, thank you. So another question coming in, and so this one's from Nikkei. Does anyone have access to or looking into the impact of incarceration over times in communities? They all three look deep in thought. Oh, here we go. They're unmuting. There we go.
I feel that, it's true. We must have criminal justice reform, no doubt about it. It's funny now how society has evolved. What used to be a major offense years ago with drugs is now a minor offense. We have many of our parents are being pulled from homes because of drugs, because of a crime, what have you. And we must take a look at that. We must reform our system, and we must do business a different way than we've been doing it if we really want to call ourselves being in the 21st century for all. Quite a few of our jails are locked up with Black and brown people. Every race creed, and color commits crimes. And you can't lay this on one group of people that are in survival mode because they did not have access to resources or quality education. We must understand what is the root cause, and stop trying to give it a quick society blanket feel-good answer.
Yeah, thank you for that, Keith. That's incredibly well said. I would just follow up with that kind of from the data side that incarceration is something that maps entirely onto the arrow. I mean, the racial divides there are as stark as any other issue, perhaps even starker. And yeah, there's two data sets. I mean, there's two justice systems in this county, in the city, in this country. And yeah, incarceration is entirely disproportionate, as well as, you know, again, like the following issues that come from having a parent that's incarcerated, the effects that has on children, the effects that has on the community. And so you see these ripple effects as well as the initial effects too. Yeah, I mean, it's just absolutely the need to reform the way that the criminal justice system works everywhere.
And society must understand, Evan, if I might add, I remember the story when we started wraparound services. Mr. Bakawi used to say, he said, as an AP physics teacher in Kashmir High, he said, you know, I have to start a one-stop shop that will address so many socioeconomic issues because I'm having trouble. My children are coming in the classroom hungry. They're coming in with issues outside of the structure itself in the institution. He said one student had her head on the desk one day. And he said, my dear, why do you have your head down on the desk? I'm trying to, teach, what have you. She kept her head down. He said, tell me, what's wrong? She said, my mother was killed last night. We must understand that we must help our students, yes, but we must help our Black and brown communities because they're suffering. So much is going on, and especially with our youth, because they want to aspire to be doctors, lawyers, business owners, what have you. But if they're dealing with so much outside of school, then how do we expect to get an A when the child is going through so much mentally? As adults, could we go through that and get an A? We must ask ourselves, put ourselves in the place of our children who are suffering.
Thank you. We are 2 minutes to our 1 o'clock. We had a full hour, but there was so much shared during this hour. So really just thankful for this ongoing conversation. I have 2 minutes, so maybe this one last question, since we are kind of inundated with social media, is there any data around social media platforms and marketing and how it impacts communities differently?
That one stumped me. I'm not sure. I apologize.
Yeah, same. I'm sorry, I don't have any thoughts to speak to that.
Folks are sharing contact information in the chat though. So if we want to share that quickly for follow-up, if anyone wants to talk more about anything, you can check there.
Yes, please. We're happy to share their contact information. We'll also follow up after this session with all the amazing resources that were shared in the chat, along with contact information for anyone who has additional questions or wants to further have a conversation. So we're now at 1 o'clock again. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We are so thankful to Leah, Evan, and Keith for sharing their time and sharing their work with us.
Hey, Jessica, if I may. My name is Curtis McMahon. Well, I'm labeled Jessica Davison on this chat, so Hey, it's a great name. On behalf of United Way, I want to thank you all for attending our Data and Dish series today. We're offering these series. It's what, once a month, Jessica? Is that, or it's periodically every other month or so. And really the purpose behind these series is to bring people together to talk about data, to hear from practitioners, experts in the field of opinion, of science, of economics. And so we really hope that you will continue participating. Of course, when United Way is bringing people together, we're going to have different opinions and perspectives shared. And these are all the perspectives of the individual contributors and not necessarily United Way. And so we want you to come in, bring your voice, have a conversation so that we can all learn from each other and continue this dialogue, because really data and communicating the effects of poverty, the effects on communities of color is so critical to us making Houston better for everyone. So just want to thank you all so much for the great content and for your engagement, especially in the chat. One of the best chats we've had ever. So thank you all so much for being here today.